When I first saw this detachment, I was a bit underwhelmed and I thought it looks really quite weak. But now that I've had more of a chance to look through it, there is actually some solid positive rules here. Now, don't get me wrong, is this going to replace the Gladius or be as good as, say, the Inner Circle Task Force or the Stormlance Task Force? Probably not. If you are looking for pure competitive lists, one of those three will very likely fill your needs better overall. But if you want to run more of a mixed wing list with some Terminators, with some bikes to fit that Dark Angels theme and be a bit more on the fluffy side while still having some teeth, this detachment can really bring a lot for you on that front. And there really are some very nasty tricks that you can pull with this detachment that could at least make it potentially a consideration if you are going into maybe a smaller, slightly less competitive local tournament, but you still want to do well. The Lion's Blade Task Force is the 4th Dark Angels specific detachment, and whilst the Inner Circle Task Force is generally considered to be fairly solid, the Unforgiven and the Company of Hunters are really quite subpar. So it is nice to have that extra detachment available to us now, and the main rule for it comes in the form of In the Lion's Claws. What this rule means is that an enemy unit, excluding monsters and vehicles, if they want to fall back when they are in engagement range of a Ravenwing unit, they have to make a desperate escape test, meaning that even just falling back could cost your opponent a few destroyed models, and this is made even worse if they are battle shocked because that test is done at -1 to the roll. So it's a really scary prospect for tying up some enemy units and very much locking them down quite effectively, because they will in some situations take even more damage by falling back than they might by staying in combat. And then this part of the rule combos quite well with the second part of the rule, which means that when a Ravenwing unit is within engagement range of an enemy, a Deathwing unit in your army gets +2 to their charge rolls against that enemy unit. So essentially, you move in with your bikes and your speeders, you lock the enemy down, and then you let your knights and terminators get a much more reliable charge into them to deliver that knockout punch. So it's quite thematic and fun. It isn't the greatest detachment rule, it does require a lot of setup, and the Ravenwing units themselves aren't the best in terms of their datasheet overall, but I do think it can be played around with fairly well. Single units of ATVs are very cheap, and they are going to be great ways to charge in and unlock a potential 7-inch charge for a nearby deep striking unit of Terminators, or something like a bigger blob of Black Knights can actually be quite good in its own right. So bringing those to bring those buffs for your Deathwing units could be a very worthwhile prospect. And then you have to remember as well, things like Dreadnoughts gain the Deathwing rule in the Dark Angels armies, so giving them +2 to charges and getting things like your Brutalis Dreadnoughts into combat that much more reliably can make them really quite scary at going into your opponent. And this is where I think it does have an advantage over the Inner Circle, because it doesn't specify infantry only on a lot of the Deathwing stuff. It is just everything, so your Dreadnoughts can actually take advantage of more of this stuff here. Overall, I would say it has some potential. The reliance on the poorer Ravenwing units does hold it back for sure. Now, maybe if they were a bit cheaper or they were a bit better in terms of their data sheets, this detachment overall would have a lot more teeth. But I do think at some point you have to weigh up if it isn't better to just bring more Deathwing and maybe swap over to the Inner Circle Task Force. But for you combined arms players, this does make a combo of Ravenwing and Deathwing much more attractive than it has ever been before in 10th edition, and it definitely fills in the fantasy of Dark Angels as well, with the Ravenwing hunting down the targets, keeping them locked in place, and then the Deathwing just teleporting in or charging in to finish them off. So I do like it from a fluff perspective. I just think it is only okay from a rules one. However, where things do get a bit juicier is in the enhancements. There are, of course, 4 as usual, and they are actually all pretty great. The first up is Calibanite Armaments, which is a cheap 15 points, and very simply gets you +1 damage on your melee weapons. So this can be quite significant. Think 3 damage Power Fists, 3 damage Crozius on your Bike Chaplain, even 3 damage on the Ravenwing Champion's power weapon means he will be throwing out 6 Strength 5, -2 AP, 3 damage swings, which is a quite impressive bit of melee to add to something like a unit of Black Knights. So this is a great, cheap, always useful enhancement just to stick on a character with your last 15 points. Lord of the Hunt is also 15 points, and this one is for Ravenwing only, so a chaplain on a bike or on the Ravenwing command squad. The bearer's unit is eligible to shoot and charge after it's fallen back, and it also rerolls desperate escape tests. The main thing for this is the shoot and charge after falling back, which is a pretty solid rule in its own right anyway, but in this detachment it just gets much better, because it means you can now bounce a squad of bikers around the board from enemy unit to enemy unit right when you need that easier charge on your Deathwing, so bringing that +2 to charge range to a unit that has just deep struck in or has moved up the board to try and get a charge onto that key enemy unit. It is just a fantastic way to keep that flexibility in your army and bring your detachment buff right where you need it every single turn. So for just 15 points, I am actually a big fan of this one, and I do think that in the proper combined arms approach with this detachment, it is going to be almost crucial for your game plan. Up next, we have the 25-point Stalwart Champion. This is the priciest of the lot, and I would say actually the least impressive of the bunch. It goes on a captain, a chaplain, or a lieutenant, and it just gives the unit +1 to the OC value of the models in the unit, as long as they're not battle shocked. So this could be helpful, sure, bringing some extra OC when you are going to be running probably quite a small elite army is always a benefit. It can certainly help you keep those objectives safer or much more easily dive in and steal them from an enemy, even with a smaller unit of bikes, for instance. But it is still quite a lot to be paying for 25 points, so whether this one gets passed up in favour of the other 3, I do think that might be likely. It's not bad, I just think it does face stiff competition from the other enhancements. And then finally, we have the Fulgus Magna. This is 20 points, so it's again a little bit pricey, but I think this one is really strong. It's a Deathwing model only, but this lets your unit once per battle, as long as they're not in engagement range of any enemies, jump up off the board and into strategic reserves. Now, as I said yesterday with the Deathwing, movement is key in 40k, and an uppy-downy ability is always brilliant to have. Bringing it on a chaplain and a unit of Deathwing Knights, or even another character and a full 10-man unit of Terminators, gives them so much more threat range, especially since you can also potentially combo this with the detachment rule to drop them somewhere where they can turn their 9-inch charge into a 7-inch one into a key enemy unit. It is just fantastic value for what you pay, and it really can be a game-changing move, even though it is only once per battle. So this one I do really like. I can honestly see it being taken pretty much every game. It just brings so much utility in general, but especially I think in this detachment, thanks to the combo that it plays with the Ravenwing. On top of that, you do get the usual 6 stratagems. 5 of them are 1 CP and 1 of them is 2 CP, and they are generally all fairly solid. Again, I can see all of them getting used at some point in the course of a game, and a few in particular I think are exceptionally strong. First is Overpowering Exaction. This is 1 CP, and you use it in either the command phase or the start of the fight phase, and you pick an enemy unit in engagement range of one of your units, and they have to take a battle shock test. And it is at -1 if your unit is a Deathwing or a Ravenwing unit. So kind of like the Death Guard one yesterday, it is a useful, if admittedly a little swingy, way to potentially force an enemy unit to be untargetable by stratagems, or just not be able to hold that objective that you may have been gunning for, and just disrupt the enemy's battle plans. So yes, it is a little swingy, you can't really rely on it even with the -1, but it is a good stratagem to have if you just absolutely need to stop an opponent from getting a stratagem or an objective. Knights of Iron is next and is again 1 command point. This is in your movement or your charge phase. You can pick a Ravenwing unit and it can move, advance or charge through terrain features. Now we all know 10th edition has a lot of cover and it has terrain literally everywhere on most boards, and it can be a nightmare for big blobs of units like bikers, and that isn't really going to be a problem anymore. Not only does this stratagem help your mobility and getting into tough to reach enemies, it can also mean you can now much more easily keep your squad safe and hidden behind line of sight blocking terrain so that they are ready and safe from shooting until you need them to go out and strike and charge the enemy. So I think this one is brilliant, not only as a really great offensive tool for getting you into a combat much more easily through difficult terrain, but it's also a really great defensive tool because you can keep your unit safe and not worry about them being essentially wasted for a turn, having to move around terrain. You can just yeet through it and not have to worry about it. So it's a really good offensive and defensive stratagem, I think, and it's going to immediately make those bigger units of Black Knight and the Ravenwing Command Squad much more useful than they ever have been in 10th edition before. Third up, we have the ever-present Armour of Contempt. It's in every Space Marine detachment. It's always useful. It's a solid way to boost your durability, giving an enemy attack -1 AP in the shooting or fight phase. It definitely helps, especially with your elite units like your bikes and your Terminators especially with their 2-up save. It is just a generally brilliant strat, and you will always like having it in your back pocket to pull out when you need. Illuminating Fire is used in the shooting phase by a Ravenwing unit. This one lets you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches that was chosen as the target by your Ravenwing unit, and then, until the end of the phase, every Deathwing unit that also shoots at that target will get +1 to wound. So essentially, it can sound a little confusing, but essentially you ride up to within 12 inches, unleash some firepower with your Ravenwing, and then all of your Terminators, your Dreadnoughts, your Land Raiders, anything Deathwing keyworded, which includes Azrael and Hellblasters, if you've forgotten that, from the Inner Circle Task Force, so they will benefit too. Everything like that gets +1 to wound. So it's a very solid stratagem. It is admittedly not amazing on things like your generic Terminator Stormbolters, but there is a lot still that you can bring in this detachment that will love getting +1 to wound. So I do quite like this one, even if it does require a little bit of setup and synergy by your Ravenwing to actually get it going. Strength and Unity is the last 1 command point strat. This is in your fight phase. You get to pick a unit from your army that was selected as the target of an enemy unit's attacks. And if the enemy unit was within engagement range of a Ravenwing unit, then they are -1 to their hit rolls. If they are within engagement range of a Deathwing unit, then if the strength of their attack is higher than the toughness of the target unit, they also get -1 to their wound rolls. So this can be a double stack of -1 to hit and -1 to wound if you are in combat with an enemy with Ravenwing and Deathwing around them. Now, it specifically doesn't stack with Armour of Contempt, so you can't get a unit being -1 to hit, -1 to wound, and -1 to their AP, but still it can get you a very solid durability buff, and it does mean, of course, you can still use Armour of Contempt on another unit. So if you had, say, a Ravenwing and a Deathwing unit in that same combat, you can get both of them being much more durable against enemy attacks. So I think this is, again, a really, really solid stratagem, and being 1 CP is potentially mind-blowingly good if you do have that combo of a Ravenwing and a Deathwing unit in that same combat. Finally, we have the 2 command point strat. This is Inescapable Wrath, and this one is just pure nightmare fuel for your opponent. This lets you, at the end of your opponent's charge phase, pick a Deathwing infantry or walker unit that is within 6 inches of an enemy unit and eligible to charge, and you can just attempt to charge. Now, yes, this sounds a lot like heroic intervention, but it's not, because it doesn't require the enemy unit to have charged. So if your opponent has just moved up to within 6 inches to maybe get a toe on an objective, but not actually charged anything, they are still fair game. And this makes it just absolutely horrible for your opponent to try and play any sneaky tricks around your objectives that your Deathwing are anywhere near to. Now, you don't get any charge bonuses if you do this, so no strike first or anything, but with, say, a Terminator Captain in a unit of Deathwing Knights, you can now, for 1 command point, because they can reduce it by 1 as a Captain, you can get a 1 command point re-rollable charge in the enemy's charge phase. So it is insanely good. And if there is another ongoing combat with some Ravenwing involved, for instance, then bam, with the detachment, you can get an extra 2 inches on top of that. So you could, in theory, in a best case scenario, get a 1 command point re-rollable charge with +2 to your charge roll in the opponent's charge phase, which is really good. It can make your Terminators scarily fast and mobile in this detachment, even without considering how they can interact with the Raven Wing. So yes, it's expensive if you don't have a captain, being 2 command points, but it's very, very, very powerful. And if you use it right, it can make your objectives almost impossible for your opponent to steal. All in all, I do really like this detachment. It has massively grown on me since I read it earlier today. I do still stand that it isn't as good as things like the Gladius or even the Inner Circle Task Force, but it is much, much better than you may initially think just looking at the detachment rule. Because yes, whilst the detachment rule itself is arguably a little bit mediocre, the enhancements and the stratagems are really strong, and they do play into the detachment rule really well, which make it much better than it may initially appear in isolation. I think the only thing that's disappointing about this is that in the Lion's Claws and the fact that it's called the Lion's Blade Task Force, it doesn't interact with the Lion, and that's more the fact that the Lion doesn't have the Deathwing or Ravenwing keywords, which I think he should. I think there would be a lot of fun in him having those keywords so that he could interact with some of the stratagems in this detachment. I think that would be fun and make him more competitive. I don't think it would make him oppressive or too low costed or anything. I think it would just make him good. So I kind of hope they do that in the upcoming data slate. That would be one of the few things that I would love to see for the Lion. But all in all, if you love Deathwing and Ravenwing and you enjoy playing the mixed wing style of lists from earlier editions, this can definitely let you relive a lot of those glory days and bring a fun, fluffy, still reasonably strong army to the board, especially if you are bored of running the Gladius all the time. But that's going to be it for this video. What do you make of this detachment, and how do you think it compares to the other Dark Angel specific ones? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.